Hello party people and welcome to Costa Rica, doing an office hours in Costa Rica here aboard the beautiful Princess Caribbean. You know, I should probably, or pretty Caribbean Princess, should probably give you just a little look of the ship itself there. Why did I do that? Because now I got to set up the camera thing again. Golly, I'm just not a very bright filmmaker, am I? That's not what you come here for, though. Thank goodness you come here for SQL Server answers, and I have a few of these. So let's go through your top voted questions from PollGab. Number one is from gotqn. Says, in SQL Database, we have SP invoke external REST endpoint. It's a fancy name for a stored procedure that just goes and calls REST APIs. It says, but in SQL Server 2022, we still do not. Is using machine learning in SQL Server with like SP execute external script a good idea or a nasty hack? So it depends on what you're calling it for and whether you're making other things like inserts, updates, and deletes wait for that API call. Because sooner or later, the API call isn't going to work. The app servers on the other end are going to be having an outage. There's going to be a network blip, whatever. So if you have some kind of SQL Server-based process that's having to wait 30 seconds for a timeout, and then you don't have good error handling inside your code, nobody has good error handling inside their code, inside their T-SQL, then I would say it's a pretty bad idea. What I would always much rather have people do is just go have an application, if you will, that watches a table, and when new rows come up or when there's something that needs to be done, goes and batches off calls to that API, that REST API instead, because it's much easier to do and much more common to do really good error handling inside the app in things like C# or Java, whatever you build your regular code in, instead of trying to do it in a database at the same time dealing with locking and blocking and concurrency issues while you're trying to call that API. Next up, Chase asks, if you had complete authority to focus Microsoft on fixing or adding a feature to SQL Server, what would you choose? It's probably good that I don't have complete say over Microsoft with stuff like this, because I know I'm just one weird edge case performance tuner guy. I mostly do engine performance tuning. I've never paid Microsoft for SQL Server licensing a day in their lives. They should focus on whatever paying users want them to do. But if you gave me that capability, the two things that I really struggle with. One is I would love to have weight stats inside the per database level, because people often tell me, well, we don't care about that database. We only care about this one right here. Well, Speedy, what'd you put them on the same server for? Why don't you put them on different servers? But people don't think like that. They just want to be able to performance tune each database individually and gather the weight stats from it. Somebody's going to say query store, that doesn't work with ad hoc queries, which is the next thing that's on my list. The other thing that I wish Microsoft would work on, I wish they would give us the ability to group similar queries together in query store, like by query hash, because there are a lot of applications out there. These days, it's like 1 in 3 or 4 servers that I work with, where the developers either haven't parameterized their T-SQL, so every query comes in with a unique query, a different query plan and so forth. It's basically like sticking option recompile on your queries. Or else they're dealing with the entity framework in problem, when with entity framework, when you pass a list of values like in ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's going to be built as a different string every time. So it blows up the plan cache, it makes query store useless. So those are the two things that I would have them focus on fixing. Easier performance tuning at the database level with weight stats per database, and then better aggregation of queries inside query store. But you know what? I got to be careful what I wish for, because if they made those things easier, I wouldn't have a job, if you can call this a job, and I'd probably have to stop jetting around the world on cruises, seeing glorious locations. So maybe I better keep my mouth shut. Next up, I like hot pot. I always wonder, that's like the kind of thing I've talked about on, I think, TikTok and Instagram. I always wonder if y'all catch up on those things. I like hot pot says, hi Brent, are any of your clients using SQL Server 2022 in production yet? Yes. If yes, how bad is it? I think I talked about on the last office hours that I don't think it was ready for production, but that specifically refers to the features that they touted in SQL Server 2022. As long as you stay away from the features that are brand new in SQL Server 2022, wait till those get fixed. Azure Synapse link, managed instance link, things like that. Then it's really not bad. I know I have a lot of problems with parameter sensitive plan optimization, but only in the sense that it makes monitoring harder. As long as you don't care about monitoring, it's fine, which sounds like I'm being sarcastic, but it really is fine. Next up, Peter says, hi Brent, our developers are writing parameterless table-valued functions as opposed to views. Beyond the extra syntax required, is there a demonstrable downside, or should I just step away even though I think it's horrible? Go check out in my Mastering Query Tuning class the module on user-defined functions, and I go into detail on that. That's the Mastering Query Tuning class, user-defined functions. Junior Wannabe DBA says, hi Brent, what do you think is the best way to trigger, and by trigger he means fire and forget, don't wait for a result, an external application from an insert into a SQL table? It's just like that answer I gave a second ago. You don't want to do that in database code. What you want to do when you want to have application logic that calls an application is you want to have what's called, you might cleverly guess, an application. Applications don't belong in the database because, as you might also guess from the name database, it's the place where your data is based. It's not called the application base or the middle tier base, it's called the database. Now don't get me wrong, Microsoft will gladly tell you, well, step right over this way, you can put C# code in the database, you can put in service broker, all kinds of things you can do. Yes, you can, but as Jeff Goldblum said, just because your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't think whether or not they should. You shouldn't put concurrency code inside the database itself that calls external things, because there's no such thing as a fire and forget in SQL Server. Something is going to have to call that API, and that's going to end up blocking, and it can block on the queuing table that you're working with, for example. Put application code in the application. Next up, Mr. SqlSeeks says, we're upgrading our Azure VMs, and our folks are suggesting using a VM size that has burstable IOPS. When I think about this is his words, not mine. When I think about troubleshooting performance issues and scalability testing, I have to figure out whether those things were executed during a burst or not, and I feel like I want consistent IOPS in prod. Well, of course you want them. Are you paying for them? No, you're not, are you? The company pays for them. What would it be like if the company said, well, all right, Mr. SqlSeeks, you can have consistent IOPS, but we're going to take the cost out of your paycheck. You'd be like, whoa, 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 not so fast. Burstable IOPS are great. I like to think of them as unpredictably fast. Yes, sometimes they're going to be slow, but also sometimes they're going to be fast. If you took the same cost for burstable IOPS and you tried to get continuous IOPS drives at that same price, say you're spending $1,000 a month on the burstable IOPS drive and you spent $1,000 a month on continuous IOPS, it's going to suck. It's going to be a terrible drive. What you think you want is you think you want a really fast continuous IOPS drive. Go check the prices. Odds are the business is going to be much less interested in that than you are. Next up, Mike asks, if I'm hosting availability groups on Azure VMs, can I have a couple of different replicas with different sizes, like one with 32 cores and one with 4 cores? Okay, so you can, but what happens when you fail over? What happens when you fail over from a replica that's got 32 cores over to a replica that's got 4 cores? It's going to be, the technical term for this is slow. Your queries are going to run very poorly. Your users are going to be upset. So as long as your users are okay with that, then I totally am. I've got one client who has a situation like that where they run 80 core primary replicas all day long. When they have a failover, they have told their users the secondary server will barely respond to queries. That's okay. We're going to take 1 hour to troubleshoot why the big one went down. And if after 1 hour we can't resuscitate it, then we'll take a brief outage on the secondary, up it to 80 cores, and then start it back up again. But this way they save a lot of money for Azure hardware that they're not using. So it doesn't really affect you in terms of licensing as long as you're under software assurance. But those Azure VM costs can add up really fast, especially for big CPUs like that. Chandwich asks, hey Brent, have you ever had a client refuse to install your SPBlitz stored procedures? If so, how do you handle that situation? These days I measure it during the sales calls. Before you can have a sales call with me, you have to send me this wind is drying my throat out. Before you can have a sales call, probably the 2 Mai Tais that I had this morning also are related to my throat drying out. I digress. They were also doubles. That's neither here nor there. These days, I tell clients, here you've got to send me this information from my consultant toolkit, which calls SPBlitz, SPBlitz cache, and that kind of thing. If they won't run that, I'm like, okay, no problem. Good day, best of luck. You can go find another consultant. And it's not that I refuse to, I'm too good for that. It's just that I try to solve a whole lot of client problems in a really short period of time. If they don't trust me enough to use the first responder kit scripts, then the engagement is going to take much longer, and I don't want to work with them for a week to get across the finish line instead of rapidly working through clients every 2 days. I'm kind of like an emergency room surgeon. You don't want to hang out with me for very long. You want to get out of my care as quickly as possible. So I tend to focus on emergency turnaround gigs, and I just refer them to other firms who are willing to work without using the first responder kit. Next up, TheyBlameMe says, hi Brent, what's your preferred strategy when updating a limited downtime production system from an integer primary key to bigint? I like piping the data into a new table that has the structure that I want. The other thing that's nice with that is usually when you're changing those integers, you're usually also changing other columns in there. You also have to do a bunch of other child tables, bunch of other related tables, because you're going to future-proof that system. Do them all to bigint all in one fell swoop. Pipe the data over into a new table. And you're like, well, hold on, that's going to be an outage because it's going to take a while. Yes, but you can use triggers to keep the data in sync. As people do inserts, updates, and deletes on the primary table, you can log those to a table somewhere, and then at the end of your process, merge them all together and switch over to the brand new table. I give you starter code for stuff like this in my mastering query tuning class in the batching module. It's not specifically designed just for this one particular task. It's designed for all kinds of things that you may have to do to take a huge amount of work and nibble it off into smaller pieces that'll work with better concurrency. The other thing to search for is if you search for Michael J. Swart, blue-green deployments. Michael J. Swart, blue-green deployments. He has a 5 or 6 part blog post series on how you go about accomplishing tasks like this, piping the data into a new table. And then last up, Netanel says, when is a high perfmon value for skipped ghost records per second ever a concern? SPBlitz first is reporting that I've got 53,000 skipped ghost records per second. What that means is that ghost cleanup isn't able to complete on your server, and your SQL server is having to read 53,000 rows per second that it shouldn't have to read. If you want to reduce CPU and logical reads on your queries without doing query tuning, without having to change indexes, without affecting query results, you want to start going about removing those ghost records. So how do you do it? You won't see a lot of blog posts on this because it's a topic that was much more familiar with like 20-year-old servers. This is like a SQL Server 2000 kind of issue, big time. So if you search for that perfmon counter, you're going to see 20-year-old blog posts, and you're going to be like, That's not necessary. That's like the Bible. Things have changed since then. To my ties, this is what happens when I start going off topic. But the things that are in those kinds of articles will clue you in on it. It has been a decade since I've had to deal with it. If I remember right, the fastest, easiest way was to rebuild the index involved with all the ghost records. The problem is that you're not going to know which index it is. And some of those articles will kind of give you a clue as to what you want to look for. You want to look for tables that have a high number of deletes. Queuing tables, for example, where you're logging rows and then deleting them. Session tables. And it's probably going to be a heap, if I remember right. So a heap with lots of deletes. SP Blitz Index will warn you about that too as well. It doesn't say ghosted records, but it'll say a heap with lots of deletes. Those would probably be good places to start on rebuilding those. And like Beyonce says, if you love it, put a key on it. All right, that wraps it up for this episode of Office Hours. I am going to go out and go hit Costa Rica. We're docked in Costa Rica today for along our 10-day Caribbean cruise Panama Canal trip. Yesterday, I actually filmed this exact same set of questions I filmed in Panama at the Panama Canal. And for some reason, I had my camera set up so that it was shooting slow-mos. So I got a slow-mo of Office Hours with no audios. So I'll have to find snippets or edit snippets of that and post it up somewhere. Hope y'all had fun, and I will see y'all on the next Office Hours. Adios.